Hi, this is Margaret from the blog Don't Call It Bollywood, and my dog, whose head might pop up every once in a while. Today I want to talk about media, which I've been thinking about a lot related to Sonam Kapoor's wedding, because she seemed to handle the media there in a different way than had been done before, at least recently. Essentially, media wasn't invited, but she knew that people would have cell phones and would be taking videos and posting them on Twitter and so on and so forth, and she seemingly just didn't care. It wasn't one of those parties where all the phones were collected at the beginning of the night and so on and so forth, which means we get this rare opportunity to actually see inside the room. Now, that made me start thinking about how media has changed over the years in general and specifically within the Indian film industry. If you talk about film anywhere in the world, the starting point was always that the movies existed without any stars, without anybody necessarily being in them. The first movie star, the first person who was identified by name in a film, was the Biograph Girl, which actually referred to 3 separate women. But all of them appeared in Biograph motion pictures in America in the very early teens, or even before the teens, in the first decade of the 19th century. And people really liked these women, so they wanted to start talking about them, and then wanted to see more movies that had these women in them. But there were no credit sequences at that point. Names weren't known. There were no interviews. There was no nothing. So people just said, oh, I want to see more movies with that Biograph Girl. Eventually, the film studios realized, well, this is a selling point. People want to see that Biograph Girl. If we tell them who she is and we tell them she'll be in this movie, they will come see this movie. So again, I'm still talking about Hollywood. Fan magazines started coming up and were heavily supported by the studios. They coordinated interviews with their stars. They created these whole image packets for their movie stars, which would help sell films. And remember, this is also the early years of film, so there was no wide release, which means there was no necessarily coordinated split-second timing for these promotions. You had to give your star an identity that would work for all of their movies for many, many years at once, because you had no idea what the audience would be seeing. The audience might read an interview with Mary Pickford, for instance, and then they might see a new Mary Pickford movie the next week. Or they might read an interview with Mary Pickford, and then it would be 4 years before whatever movie she was in at the time she gave that interview finally made it to their town. So you had to make sure, no matter which came first, the film or the interview, everything was consistent, which meant these images were sort of timeless. It wasn't like they were changing picture by picture. It was static. The interview would go along with whatever movie the audience happened to watch from that actor that week. So that's Hollywood generally, but a similar pattern happened in India, just with different timing. In the early years of film, people knew the names, but you didn't necessarily know much else about these actors. I notice this every time I try to write a history post on these actors. For instance, a photo of Prithviraj Kapoor with his children when they were children does not exist. And Prithviraj was a major movie star at that time. It just wasn't considered important. You wouldn't have an interview with the star at home or photos of him and his wife or anything that personalized him. You just had the person on screen. There's tons of photos of Prithviraj from movies and so on. He was a familiar face, but you didn't necessarily know anything more about him. That started to change in the 1950s in India. That's when the first major film magazines were founded for the Hindi language industry, FilmFare and Screen, both of them branching off of newspapers. So there were local Bombay newspapers that had tiny little film sections already, but it was assumed that this information was only interested to the local Bombay people or people who would make an effort to subscribe to Bombay papers from elsewhere in the country, and it was only interesting for a small area. It wasn't considered enough to fill an entire magazine that would be distributed nationally until the 1950s, which was also the era when the Indian box office took off. The Hindi film distribution everywhere in the world took off. I mean, Hindi films were going as far away as Greece by the 1950s and 60s. And also, of course, when the star system really took off. Thanks to the new investment structures, there no longer needed to be the security of the strong studio system in Indian film. You could have films that were much more star-based, all of which is very friendly to celebrity-focused news, and thus Screen and FilmFare, those 2 magazines. Now, the first few years of those magazines were similar to the first few years, again, in Hollywood in the 20s and 30s. The idea was to make us feel like we knew the stars like they were like us, but a little bit better. They had to be a little bit better because otherwise you wouldn't bother reading about them. You know, if they're just people like us, who cares? I can just talk to my neighbors instead of reading about movie stars. But you don't want to make them completely different. You don't want to make them scandalous, horrible people. You want to make them people that the readers would actually like and enjoy reading about. The biggest thing that I noticed with this is that FilmFare founded its own Screen Awards, as did Screen. In Hollywood, the Academy Awards were founded as a PR move because the producers started to notice that real stories were getting out about movie stores. Stories about affairs and drugs and all sorts of things that people in America did not like. So rather than selling a simple, they're hardworking good folk just like us kind of storyline, they switched to selling they're artists with a capital A and they get awards and they're important and they're contributing to the world. And that was the purpose of the Academy Awards, to very much legitimize the industry and give people something to look up to. Now, in India, FilmFare, the media, did that for the stars, literally did that, created the awards show and the whole structure. They bought into the whole idea that these stars are better than everyone else, and it's a good thing to promote, that these stars are a little something extra and a little something special. So that was the status until the 1970s. And then in the 1970s, Stardust and CineBlitz were founded. CineBlitz's first tagline, which I love because it's so clever, is all the news from C to Z, everybody else covers AB. Because it was founded in 1974 when all the news was just about Amitabh Bachchan. Now, Stardust and CineBlitz, they would tell the rumors that had just been whispered before. It wasn't that these stories were unknown necessarily. It was more that the details came out through a gossip pipeline. I'm sure we all know India has an incredibly sophisticated gossip pipeline. And then the old media, Screen and FilmFare, would just subtly encourage it. One thing that I found was an old photo from FilmFare, which the point of the photo, supposedly, was to show Nargis and Raj Kapoor meeting with a young fan. Isn't this nice of them to meet this little girl who wanted to meet them? But buried in the caption of the photo, it points out that Nargis and Raj Kapoor are still in their sleep clothes at a breakfast table. So the photo technically is of them with a young fan, but if you know what to look for, it's also confirming that Raj and Nargis spent the night together and are now having breakfast together. So this is what Screen and FilmFare would do. Everybody sort of knew the stories already. All they had to do was very subtly hint at them, or maybe ask a leading question in an interview and wait to see what happens. Stardust and CineBlitz, they would just straight up print the stories with very little confirmation. You could call them up and tell them anything you wanted and they would print it. They didn't care because people were buying the magazines. And the funny thing was, about half their content, and this is still true today, is true. I mean, a lot of rumors have a basis in fact. But then the other half isn't, and it's up to the reader to figure out which are you going to believe and which seems true and which seems fake. Now, everything changed again. In the late 1990s, suddenly the internet and the internet gossip boom came in, and all of a sudden these news stories weren't limited to weekly magazines. They were limited to content that had to be constantly reinvented and constantly brought forth. Now, as recently as the 1990s, when the cons all started, Stardust and CineBlitz and FilmFare and Screen were the ones that dominated, and those were the ones that you had to know how to handle. And people did learn how to handle them. Shah Rukh Khan famously blacklisted CineBlitz and issued death threats personally by going to the guy's house when a reporter implied that he was having an affair with a co-star. Because that's the only way you could handle CineBlitz and the magazines like that. They would truly print anything. The only way you could handle it was either by threatening them so fiercely that they would be scared off, or just ignoring it entirely, which is what Amitabh Bachchan did. But then, once the internet came on, it was very different. It wasn't just that people were printing these long stories once a week and you could scare them away. It's that these stories would come out and then would be spread and suddenly repeated over and over and over again so fast you couldn't stop them. And more than that, there was this sudden desperate need for content. All of a sudden, there's photographers everywhere taking pictures of everything, which very much changes the way stars lived their lives. And all of this I find fascinating, but I'm going to save for a second video specifically about how stars reacted to the changing media of the recent era. This video is just to give you the overall sense of film stars going from people where almost nothing is known about them, they're just images on screen, to people where you have this very crafted and careful image of them as like us, but slightly better, to people who suddenly the legends are being torn down and gossip is everywhere. Anyway, that's how it looks to me. You can agree, you can disagree, you can tell me how cute my dog was. Just leave me a message. There's a link to my blog right below. Thanks. Bye.